Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back. This is a bit of a follow-up to a video that I recorded on created heterozygosity, a young Earth creationist hypothesis for where all the diversity of, or the genetic diversity comes from that is in different species and different kinds of organisms. Now, by follow-up, I really should say a small tangent, not nearly as long a video as that created heterozygosity one. I was walking out of my office yesterday, and after I had recorded that video, and I noticed on my bookshelf this book right here. The answers book. I said, I don't feel like I have the answers to everything. But look, there's an answers book. Maybe I should look in there. So you don't know what I'm talking about. The Answers book is a series of books now that Answers in Genesis has. There's called the Answers book, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, and it presumes to provide you with the simple answers to all of the most important questions of life. And often if you go to like an Answers in Genesis or, Young Earth Creationist seminar, and the speakers get up and give some talks, and at the end it's like, if you have any questions, go in the back. We've got the Answers book, right? Purchase your Answers book and find out the answers. Okay, so what is this Answers book? You see, it's kind of a thin little thing. This is actually the original version of the Answers book. It's the second printing, but this copy is, in terms of the words, are the same as what's found in the original Answers book from 1990. And look who the authors are here. All right. So Ken Ham, Andrew Snelling, and Carl Weiland. I should probably tell you before we go any further, we're going to be answering or talking about the question, who is Cain's wife? Right? That's the question we're answering from this book. And it relates to what I talked about with created heterozygosity. So that's the connection between, I saw this book, I opened it up, and I thought, this would make a good follow-up to my video on created heterozygosity. Okay, back to the book. There we go. We've got Ken Ham, all right, of Answers in Genesis. We have Andrew Snelling, kind of his right-hand man there for a long time. He's his PhD geologist who followed him from Australia to America. And then you've got this other name, Carl Weiland, who might not be as familiar to, but Carl Weiland is also from New Zealand and still lives in New Zealand. He was Ken Ham's original partner in an organization that they founded. Actually, Carl Weiland founded, and Ken Ham was doing something else, and then they joined the two groups together to create this thing right here, which is the Creation Science Foundation, right? Based in Sunnybrook, Australia. And that organization right there see the date on here. The date on there? Don't know the date on here. This is 1990. This book was published in 1990. So at the time in 1990, Ken Ham was already in America, right? So Ken Ham, who's the main author here, he's at the Institute for Creation Research, not at Answers in Genesis. Answers in Genesis hasn't formed yet. The name Answers in Genesis, I believe, became the name of that organization in 1998. Maybe it's 99. I think it's 98 though. Ken Ham, when he first came to America, came as a speaker at the Institute for Creation Research, but he was still involved in the Creation Science Foundation in Australia with Carl Weiland, right? He's kind of on loan, doing speaking and talking for Institute for Creation Research. And then he left ICR in the early 90s in order to begin his own work. So he left with and brought Andrew Snelling from Australia and began this thing that would become Answers in Genesis in the late 90s. All right, so Creation Science Foundation originally. All right, so you've got these three Australians that are part of this organization, and they write this book together, all right? And this became a really foundational book, sort of a central book to their organization, a big seller for them. And then that has been carried on by Ken Ham with a number of other co-authors in the Answers book series that Answers in Genesis continues to add to. Now it's like a 4 or 5 volume set that is, $50 or $60 to purchase. All right, so I saw this on my shelf, and I just did a quick hey, I wonder what it says in there about. I had my own question, right? I was like, Oh yeah, that's one of the original answers books from the very beginnings of Ken Ham's ministry. What did he think about diversity of organisms and sort of rapid speciation and those types of questions back then? I wonder if one of those questions is in the answers book. It turns out it's not, which actually didn't surprise me because most of the questions have to do with a young Earth and fewer have to do with evolutionary biology. There was just not as much emphasis on evolution as there was on the age of the Earth question back in the original days or the early days of young Earth creationism. Actually, 1990s, not the early days, but nonetheless, from the 50s up through the 90s, not a lot of change and emphasis in that ministry. So just to give you an idea of what some of the questions are, this original book had 12 questions in it. And rather than show you there, maybe I'll read you some. What happened to the dinosaurs? That's still a question that is one of the primary questions that answers in Genesis, and all other Christian ministries are hit with all the time. And so it is a commonly answered question. What about continental drift? By the way, I read this little chapter real quick because I was interested, and Ken Ham spends a lot of time, or probably it's Andrew Snelling in this case, since he's the geologist, trying to poo-poo the idea of continental drift. We don't really have a mechanism. There's all these evidences of the continents maybe being together, but it's kind of like, it's interesting, but many people for many years have denied that and had other models. And so they kind of play there's multiple models and we don't really have it. This is 1990. It's not like that's not the consensus view of geology at the time, but they're still trying to resisting the idea of continental drift or plate tectonics. And of course, now young Earth creationists have embraced the idea of plate tectonics, and it's sort of like obvious that the continents were all together one time, and they believe that all the continents were together in one continent, one land mass before the flood. And that's an accommodation to plate tectonics, all right, to secular geological theory that they've adapted into young Earth creationism. So that's one area where the answers book has changed over time. The answer has changed, over time. What about carbon dating? Were there really ice ages? Did God take 6 days? How did bad things come about? Noah's flood. What happened to all the water? How did the different races arise? What about the gap theory? That's not a big question today, but it was a bigger one in the 80s and 90s. Who was Cain's wife? Now that's the one that piqued my interest. So I opened that chapter up and read it. I'm going to show you a figure from that chapter, and that's what we're going to talk about and relate it to this. Point the other direction here. Point to this created heterozygosity thing. Oh, and the fact that I talked about Cain and his, well, I made up her name, but his wife, presumed wife, right? And presumably his kids, right? Cain Jr. and others. Does distant start life prove the old universe? Classic question, with creationism. How did the animals get to places like Australia? Being Australian, they were asked that all the time in Australia when they started their creation ministry. How did the kangaroos get here? Since kangaroos are such a unique part of the fauna of Australia, and so of course he has an answer to that particular question. But we're only going to just focus on how did Cain get his wife? All right, or actually the question is, who was Cain's wife? And the first thing we learn, of course, is that, well, because Adam and Eve were the sole progenitors of all human beings, Cain was one of their children. Remember, Cain kills Abel in one of the very earliest stories in the Bible of interactions of people. And as a result of that, Cain is banished. All right. He's not given a death sentence, although really in the terms of the biblical sense of the terms, he is given a death sentence because he's sent out of the promised land, right? He's sent out of Eden, this land surrounding this immediate piece of land surrounding the Garden of Eden. They've been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right? The Holy of Holies, where because of their sin, and now they're in the area of Eden, which is still a protected and wonderful place. They're like the promised land eventually throughout the rest of the Old Testament. And then he is sent into banishment from that, which is out into the wilderness, basically out into chaos, out into the rest of the world where he'll be ravaged by, the wild animals. And so in a sense, that is kind of a death sentence. figurative death sentence for Cain. All right, so Cain sent out, and it said he goes out and he builds the first city. Right. And we said that in order to build a city, I mean, one person making it is just one person even constructing a building that constitute a city. A city has to represent at least two or more individuals, right, living together in a place that is sort of their land or their space. And then, of course, the other things that are accounted to Cain is that a variety of different things that we think of as cultural things like music and so forth are ascribed to his descendants. All right, so how did he get descendants? Well, if he had descendants, well, then he had to have offspring. If he had offspring, he must have had a spouse. Well, where did he get a spouse from? Well, one of his spouses must have been his sister. All right, must have been a daughter of Adam and Eve. And therefore, he marries his sister, or doesn't marry her. We don't have any history, right? We don't know who the spouse is. We're not even told he has a spouse. It just simply says he's sent out to build it. He builds a city. So all this is inference and speculation. But anyway, say he has a spouse, he has children, and those children then become the descendants of Cain that represent a people group on earth at that point. All right, so in my last video, we talked a little bit about some genetic problems that might arise from that, the loss of heterozygosity as a result of having to do this very, very close inbreeding of individuals. Now, what I want to show you is just one figure, the figure on the next page, and I have a slide for that. So what about this question of so what about this question of who is Cain's wife? Let me read you down the logic here. He starts out by saying, before answering this question, we need to consider 9 major points recorded in the book of Genesis. Here's the 9 facts that we know. Right? Adam was the first man. Adam lived for 930 years. Eve was given the name Eve because she's the mother of all living. Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. That's Genesis 5 and 4. Everything was very good when first created. The goodness was marred by one man sinning and having that enter into the world, Romans and Genesis 3. The creation was cursed by God because of Adam's sin. Adam was married to his half-sister. Okay, interesting little tidbit there. You wonder, well, what does that have to do with anything? The laws of incest had their origin only at the time of Moses, Leviticus 18:20. You see, he's anticipating the complaint that's going to come from his answer. The answer, of course, is where did he find his wife? Well, it's his sister. And most people will recoil from that and say, well, but isn't that a horrible, terrible thing? How could you do that? Aren't there laws against? In fact, aren't there Hebrew laws? Aren't there biblical laws against marrying or having relations with a close relative? And in fact, there are. That's Leviticus 18:20. So he says these 9 basic points provide clues that suggest Cain must have married his sister. So now, what about this whole thing with the Levitical laws? Why was it eventually outlawed that one could marry one's sister, have relationships with one's sister or a close relative? And so that's where this pedigree comes in, which I found on the next page. And that's the pedigree that fascinated me and was the reason I thought this would be kind of an interesting side follow-up to my talk on created heterozygosity. Because notice in this pedigree, okay, so notice our description here. What did Adam and Eve start with? Not just very good genes. Wait, what did Cain say? He said that everything was very good in the first creation. But on his figure here, he labels that as perfect genes, right? But the word perfect actually connotes something a little bit different than very good. All right, very good, and even in the Hebrew, right, the Old Testament Hebrew, very good is a phrase and is used multiple times in a right place, but mostly right here in Genesis. And it means complete, right? Exceedingly good and useful, right? Has purpose, right? The word perfection there is a word for perfect in Hebrew, and that word is not used in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, or even the first 11 chapters of Genesis. All right, that word perfect, is not used. All right, so had Moses wanted to describe the creation as perfect, with the connotations that come along with perfect in the Hebrew, he would have used that particular term instead of very good. All right, kind of a minor quibble, but anyway, right here, we're not calling these very good genes for, they're good, they serve their purpose, they do what they do. No, these are perfect genes. Like, there can be nothing wrong with them. And so how are they shown here? Adam here is, okay, we're picking out a gene, and we're saying that it has multiple alleles, right? Adam has 2 copies of that gene. And what is this figure showing? It's showing that Adam had 2 exact same copies of this particular gene. After all, it was perfect. If you have one perfect allele, what are you going to do with the other one? Well, it's also got to be perfect, right? So it's probably going to be the same, because one's different, then one is going to be potentially more perfect than the other one. All right. And so what does Eve have? Well, Eve also has 2 copies of this A allele, all right? This capital A allele, which he's going to call dominant later, right? And so Eve also has 2 exact copies of the same thing. So they have 4 alleles, and they're all the same between them. So what happens to Adam and Eve? We're trying to get to the answer, Ken Ham's answer, for why later on in scriptures in Leviticus that there's laws against marrying and having offspring with a relative, right? Specifically family members. All right. So we're trying to explain why that, he needs an explanation for this. And this is his reason for including this pedigree. So Adam and Eve have offspring. Well, what are they going to have? Well, they got a bunch of offspring, and he emphasizes they live for 930 years. So that's a way of saying they must have had many daughters and sons. And scriptures do say had other sons and daughters. It just doesn't say how many. So he's emphasizing the 930 years because he wants the population to expand very quickly. So there was a whole bunch of sons and daughters. And obviously some of those sons and daughters must have had offspring themselves. What would their genetic condition have been? Well, they would have passed down their chromosomes and their alleles for this particular gene that we're talking about. And since they all 4 of them are all A's, right, the perfect allele, then all the offspring would have had 2 copies of the perfect allele as well. So they're AA and AA. And then they have offspring, and they pass down the A's to their offspring, and all their offspring have all A's. They're homozygous, all right, for this condition. And so after being homozygous and then passing those down to the great-great-grandchildren, and some of those great-grandchildren, all right, have offspring with each other. And Ken Ham's idea here is that, genetically, right, scientifically, there can't be anything wrong with this, because you're starting with perfection and you're mixing perfection with perfection, and therefore you're just getting perfect kids, right? That can't have any genetic malformations. It can't have any, there's no mutations, all right? There's nothing bad here. And so mixing good with good can only result in good. And so this is his explanation for why later in scriptures, God has to come in and institute through Moses the Levitical laws that then prevent people from continuing this practice that initially was just fine because they had perfect alleles, right? This is very much of a scientific explanation for the observation of what's recorded in scriptures, right? So now what he's pointing out is that as they pass them down, time passes and degeneration occurs. Genetic entropy begins, right? Mutations take place in the gene represented by B. This mutation is not affected the body, while A is dominant gene and hides the B defect. So he's assuming, and this could happen, but this is also an oversimplification of genetics. It's very basic Mendelian genetics. the idea that if you have a mutation of an allele, that mutant allele will be recessive to the dominant version of the allele, right? You have tall corn and you have short corn, and if you cross a big T with a little t corn, you're going to get big T, little t, and the big T is going to be the winner because it's making the hormone. That's sure, that's the way some alleles interact with each other, but not all. Many new mutations have an immediate effect because there's incomplete dominance, and so both alleles are having some effect. And there's a because of incomplete dominance, you have an intermediate phenotype, so you'd immediately see a change in the phenotype of that particular thing. Side point though, the whole thing here is though, Ken Ham's suggesting that you started with perfection and you start to sprinkle in errors, right? And at first he's saying the errors don't really matter a whole lot, so for a few generations the error is being propagated, but it's in a heterozygous state, and the heterozygous state, it's not affecting the phenotype. And so in other words, the people are still perfect, right, in the sense of their phenotype, in terms of like how they work and function, because that particular mutation is hidden and doesn't have any effect. But then at some point you have offspring, and that's what he's showing at the bottom here. You have two offspring that were heterozygotes, and they meet and have offspring. And then statistically, 25% of the time, you're going to get a B and a B together, the two mutations. And then, as he says, then abnormal development happens, right? That's going to impair development. And so that particular individual is less perfect. And these mutations continue to increase over time. And so by the time you get to the flood, and then through the flood, and then of course, as you have a small population originally after the flood, well, for one thing, you had founder effects. So you could have had a bunch of bad mutations in Noah and Noah's family, right, as heterozygotes. And then they begin to, once again, have to do inbreeding, because again, it's going to be necessary for family members to have offspring with family members after the flood, right? And so at some point then lifespans begin to decrease, and this is their explanation for lifespan decreasing, is not so much, well, they would say it's God actually says that he's going to decrease their lifespans, but Answers in Genesis needs an answer, like a naturalistic answer for it. And so therefore they employ this genetic entropy argument, right? That the continuation of buildup of mutations means that the more times you hybridize with close relatives, the more often you bring out the mutations in homozygous state, and therefore that's going to have a detrimental effect. All right. And so at some point it becomes so bad, what does Moses have to do? He has to say, look, you can't be marrying relatives anymore, because this is why, we're degrading ourselves too quickly. All right. We're going to degrade ourselves too fast. We need to forestall this. Because remember, Young Earth Creation is saying it's still happening because there's still genetic entropy, and eventually it's what's going to kill us all. All right, if the Earth was allowed to exist for more than a few thousand more years, you and I wouldn't continue to exist anyway because of this buildup of genetic entropy, despite the laws that are preventing us from, marrying offspring, marrying close cousins, and so forth. So. Anyway, I just found this interesting that I found it interesting that he's employing a sort of homozygous state of Adam and Eve as his sort of vision of what perfection is. Whereas 30 years later now, we're trying as hard as we can, or Young Earth Creationists are trying as hard as we can to pack in as much possible diversity as possible into these organisms. Oh, one other thing about perfection, right? Because I find the whole concept of perfect genes difficult to wrap my head around. What exactly would be a perfect gene? Because in the context of the way the world operates today, perfect, it doesn't really make sense. Here's what I mean by this. Any particular allele has a gene, a version of a gene. And let's say they're all homozygous. Let's say that Adam and Eve had all the exact same copy because they needed an enzyme that breaks down some kind of sugar at a certain rate, and that's the best, most optimal rate for their survival. All right, for their comfort and happiness, and for everything that they do, and to allow them to live forever. That's the speed that enzyme needs to function. And if you played around with it all, it would be less than perfect in that particular environment. Oh, but I just said the word, right? In that particular environment. Right? Any animal, any organism, any plant that has an optimal gene, and you could look at any gene and say, okay, what is the best performance of this particular gene for these particular environmental conditions? Like, it's this temperature. This is the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. This is the amount of carbon dioxide I have available. This is, all these different things about our environment. What is if there's a gene that has like, okay, I've got the optimal amount of product that I'm making. But then if I, as an organism, walk 5 miles away and there's a different collection of trees there with different food, and maybe it's shady instead of sunny, and maybe it's the temperature is a little bit different there as well. Is that gene now perfect? No, it's not perfect. It can't be perfect because in some even slightly different conditions, I could probably determine that there is a better version of that gene for that particular environment. Pick whatever gene you want and determine what its function is. And then ask yourself, if I change the environment, is the way it's performing its function perfect in this environment versus this other environment? And your answer is going to be like, no, every time. It may be adequate. I'll use the word very good. It might be very good for multiple environments, but it's not perfect for anything but one particular environment that includes, like, I gave some simple traits, but really your environment is hundreds of characteristics long, hundreds of things that we could measure that make up the environment that you are living in. And that's the physical environment around, and that's all the other biotic things around you that are interacting with you. And so by its very definition, in a way, you cannot remain in the same environment. No organism can remain in the same environment. I don't think Adam and Eve, even in a perfect state, could remain in the exact same environment if they moved around, or if any other animal moved into their environment. It's going to change the environment. Now, that might be tiny, tiny changes, but imagine Adam and Eve need to move out several miles, right? Or if the garden is 10 miles wide, there's going to be a change in the environment in those different areas. Right? So as the environment changes, or organisms move to environments with different environmental conditions, there's the genes that they have no longer can be said to be perfect for that environment. Now, today, I wouldn't refer to any gene being perfect anyway, because there is no gene that is absolutely found the most optimal, code and expression and so forth in the exact right tissue and so forth. All it is good enough for that organism to survive. Might be very good for that organism to survive. And besides that, we all kind of need flexibility, right? If you had absolute optimality of every single one of your genes for a very specific environment, and you were to step out of that environment and you didn't have any flexibility at all, then you'd be much less optimal for other environments. Fortunately, most of our physiology is got some wiggle room in it, right? And so our genes are doing just a good enough job, right? And there's sort of a range at which they can be expressed, right? But if you're talking about perfection, then you're talking about not finding a range that may or may not include things you will ever experience during your life, but like, here's the moment and place I'm in right now. What's the perfect gene for me right now? The perfect gene for you might be this specific sequence and it's turned on in this specific way, and it's expressed at this certain amount, right? And then, which is all controlled by other genes and so forth. All right, I'm beating this idea to death, but the idea of perfect genes just doesn't make sense. And so those mutations that occur In Kinham's model, it's like, well, okay, that's perfect because God made it, therefore it has to be perfect. There has to be nothing wrong with it. And therefore anything you do to change that must make it suboptimal. But in fact, most mutations that occur, not most, many mutations that occur to an organism, giving it some variation, and usually there's very, very slight tweaks to the proteins, create variation in the organism, which often provides the ability to live in multiple different environments with high efficiency. Maybe not perfect efficiency, but high efficiency. And it's better to have high efficiency in multiple environments than it is to be absolutely perfect for one environment and be much less fit in all other environments. Right? That's better for an organism. So those mutations actually are helpful to an organism. They're beneficial to an organism to have that kind of variation. Okay. All right. So in this particular model, and he probably didn't think about this, or whoever drew this particular diagram showing all homozygous state and calling that perfect gene state may not really be what they were thinking. Like every single gene in the organism is going to be like the same version and we're all homozygous. But it does exhibit kind of a mindset of perfection, and then the introduction of imperfections, right? Of mutations, and how it's just a downward slope, right? You started with perfection, and then anything you added changes it, and now you have decay of that genome, and things become less fit. Okay, that's your tidbit for the day on created heterozygosity and perfect genes, and who was Cain's wife. Till next time. Talk to you later.